So now I'd like to introduce you to our first performance, that is from Kevan Manwaring from Arts University Bournemouth, so welcome Kevan.
Good evening. Good evening and happy birthday, Mary Shelley. What a space for me. This needs to be even slightly. Mary. Mary Shelley, Unbound. Rebirth. A death is a birth in reverse. The same universal forces coalesce in that remarkable moment. My own nativity caused my mother's mortality 11 days after I had arrived screaming into this world. And this seemed to set the tragic template for my adult life. The spectre of death haunted days that should have been the happiest of my life. My marriage to Percy was punctuated with tragedy. My darling children taken one by one. My premature daughter unnamed but not unmourned. Sweet Clara, beloved Bournemouth, may they be at peace, and terminated by his own. It sometimes felt that death was actually my most jealous suitor. He would countenance no other for his affections. His love was all-consuming. It eventually extinguished my own life at the age of 53. I only took a consolation in knowing our fourth and final child, Percy Florence, had finally inherited his family's wealth once his grandfather, Sir Timothy, had finally shuffled off his mortal coil. He held on to life as tightly as he had held on to the keys of his coffers, and was secure. And so it was with some relief I went to join the deceased in the sepulchre of all I love, here at St. Peter's. It was 20 minutes past 11 on a bright summer's day in late August when the remarkable thing happened. No stone rolled back or vampire arose from their coffin. A woman simply opened her eyes. Mary Shelley woke up in darkness, as though I'd swim in ink. Pitch black, hot, claustrophobic. Then she blinked and sat up. Thinking she would knock her head, she was surprised to find it flowing through wood and soil. Alarmed, she ducked back to her narrow confines to her bone cage, which fitted her like a corset. Stifled by her sex, even in death, this would not do. Finding her oppressed circumstances not to her liking, Mary decided to emancipate herself, the lot of all her kind. She pushed herself gently and floated up through the mouldering coffin, the 6 feet of good Dorset earth, the stone lid of the grave, an impressive memorial she noted with satisfaction, and stood by her own monument. Well, not exactly stood, but floated lightly above the weathered patch of grass, her long dress billowing about her like a Portuguese man of war. The feeling was odd, unsettling, but not as much as the sights and sounds that greeted her. St. Peter's was on the whole the same, the distinct spire, roof, entrance and windows. Yet what were those shiny, horseless carriages parked alongside it or roaring around the skirts of the graveyard? It was late summer, going by the heavy canopy on the trees, the pollen hazy light, the drone of bees and flies, and the swoon of heat. How long had she been underground? She looked at the raised metal inscription on her tomb. It mentioned her parents, God bless their souls, her beloved husband and surviving child. Good to see he had led a long life, a Shakespearean 70 years and 10. The nearby panel provided even more information. Nervously, she scrutinised these sibylline leaves. Surprising, especially what it said about herself. She blushed. Had posterity been kind to the memory of her family, to their legacy? It appeared so. It made her head spin to think about it. She shouldn't get too full of herself. What would her parents say? They would be proud of her, no doubt, but would challenge her ideas, her decisions, no doubt too. Hard to be the child of such formidable parents, such an altitude they soared at, rarefied heights of intellectual discourse, where the air was thin, not for all. Her beloved Percy was more than capable of flying there. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or merit pourest thy full heart into few strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher, from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest, and singing ever soar, and soaring ever singest. She bent down into the tomb, passing through stone and soil, and kissed the casket containing her husband's heart, before pushing up and away. She was curious about this new version of the world she now found herself in, full of questions. What would she find? Bournemouth beckoned, and beyond. Not bound by corporeal limits, she could travel far and fast, mayhaps at the speed of thought. Hermes unshackled, yet for now she wanted to explore her old town. A public house opposite the church caught her eye. It had her name on it. Out of morbid curiosity more than pride, she entered. Floating through the large plate glass of one of the windows, it was dark and sticky inside, with tinny music and flashing moving images on large screens stuck to the walls. It was half full of not the most sartorial or civilized clientele. It reminded Mary of a coaching inn. A young lady in a very short black dress revealed a large tattoo on her left thigh as she sat cross-legged nursing a drink. A working man waved at the bar with his pint chaser. He gasped as he seemed to notice her, shook his head as though to bring it to its fuse, and downed his whiskey quickly. Nobody took any notice of his incoherent mutterings. Customers stared at small plastic rectangles. Old people masticated their underwhelming meals in stoic bovine silence. There was a slightly depressing atmosphere about the place, despite the enforced jollity of the music. The tables were not wiped down, and there was a stale music pulp. On a whim, she considered queuing for a drink. There was no table service, but the staff looked straight through her. Apart from the drunk at the bar, no one batted an eyelid at her presence. Where was the colloquy, the intellectual discourse of, say, a London coffee house? She felt rather peeved at such a gauche establishment bearing her name. Was it vain of her to wish for a more salubrious venue with elegant decor, a good wine cellar, poetry readings, and the tinkle of a piano with a low moan of a cello? She felt a frightful snog in her reaction, but there you have it. Alas, spectres cannot be choosers, she thought to herself. We have been ruled out of life's feast. The menu is not ours to select from anymore. And yet, for some reason, Mary had been given the choice to roam at will. What strange act of providence had exhumed her, in spirit form at least, from the grave? Perhaps, like his customers, she too was a creature of habit, compelled to visit her old halls.
and so she forsook the public house, hoping to enjoy the summer's day as she wended away towards the sea. The shock of the new. Everything was jarring, sharp edges of glass and steel and concrete, and so noisy. The mechanical roar of dirt engines spewing fumes was overwhelming, as were the bins overflowing with litter. The decayed buildings vandalised with graffiti. A department store called Bill's had clearly seen better days. And other shops had evidently fared no better, their windows empty or boarded up. Standing there, staring. Mary could have been run over by an omnibus, but it passed straight through her. For a minute, she swept down the aisle between the passengers as she remained frozen. And then it was gone. But the horns of traffic carried her downwards to seek sanctuary in the central gardens, a cool, leafy oasis in the heart of the town. Sweeping down to the lawns flanking the merry little brook, Mary was pleased to see young people socialising in groups, listening to music, playing games and sharing picnics. The gardens had the atmosphere of a festival, an English Arcadia. Families and older couples promenaded along the winding paths, enjoying a bit of sun. It was obvious that Bournemouth had flourished as a holiday resort. Instinctively, she made her way towards the seafront, her eyes drawn by a large, slowly rotating Ferris wheel. A mechanical marvel worthy of Isambard Kingdom renown. She enjoyed floating up with it, seeing the sightseers in the pods revelling in the view the wheel afforded, as she did now, beholding the glorious 8 miles of golden beach, brimming on a summer's day with crowds of bathers either side of the main pier. There had been plans for a wooden jetty, but no more in her final years. So his presence was something of a surprise. A veritable London bridge. The panoramic view across the glittering sea, east towards Hengistbury Head and the distinctive needles of the Isle of Wight in the distant haze, and the familiar bulk of Ballard down beyond Poole Harbour to the west, made her heart sing. At least, the coastline had not changed too much. The sea was still a magnificent moving mirror of the ever-changing sky, but Mary grew dizzy at the elevation and niggled by raucous girls who, sensing a disturbance by some secret animal instinct, harangued the thin air angrily. And so descended to the promenade with its amusement arcades and fish chips. Pedestrians jostled with people on bicycles, scooters and skates moving at alarming speed. Mary was glad she could slip through them, making her way onto the beach. Yet here, she was alarmed by the level of near nudity in bathers young and old, equally without shame. It made her blush, and recalled the time in the French countryside when her husband-to-be had suggested they took a swim in a stream naked as Adam and Eve. That affected her principles then, but now the association with water and swimming just made her melancholic. As she stared at the rolling waves, the laughter and conversation, ululation of gulls, and boom and hiss, the sea exhausting itself on Bournemouth sands, faded, and she could see the pyre on the beach of Viareggio, where Byron, Hunt, and Trelawney cremated her beloved husband's remains after he had drowned in the boating tragedy, leaving her a widow at 24. Shuddering, she snapped out of his brown study, the swirl of light and noise and life returning around her, and made her way eastwards, past the towering blocks of flats and mulberry hotels, which led like tombstones towards the merciful oblivion which the sea ceaselessly whispered, towards Boscombe Manor, built for her by her surviving son to convalesce in, but she suddenly died before it was finished. Percy Florence had sweetly built a theatre for her, with her bedroom overlooking it, her very own theatre of dreams. When it finally opened, fundraising performances were put on to raise money for health facilities in Boston. Glittering events attended by the likes of Robert Louis Stevenson and the famous actor Sir Henry Irving, whom Bram Stoker based Dracula upon. Partly hidden behind an impressive oak, she found the building, the Shelley Theatre it was called. Appeared to be all closed up, with a notice saying it hoped to be open, pending funding. An apartment block and a medical centre were now attached to it, bolted on as it were, but at least in use. Once again she felt saddened by the perverse usage of dwellings bearing her married name. How priggish of me, she reprimanded herself, especially as the theatre has become a place of healing, aptly considering its prominence. If the good doctors there could prevent some of the tragedy that had befallen her and her family, she would be happy. She hoped the citizens of Great Britain enjoyed better health and longer lives than in her time. But now she felt compelled to explore further afield. Adieu to my lovely Bournemouth, she thought as she soared away. A spirit of the air, Mary flew in an instant to places where she had lived or lingered. The Polygon in Somerstown, London, where she was born, the boarding school in Ramsgate, Baxter's house near Dundee. It was beneath the trees of the grounds belonging to our house, or on the bleak sides of the woodless mountains near, that my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination, were born and fostered. Happy times. And then, as swift as the arrow of a Barras, down to Bath, where Percy had had a house for a while near Bath Abbey. That was no more. But the apartment of her troubled stepsister, Claire Clement, in Union Passage, remained, albeit above a shoe shop. It was here, Mary thought, floating at first very height, that I completed my manuscript of Frankenstein. Opposite it, she noticed a plaque on the wall. Descending as lightly as a dandelion seed, she saw that it did not mark this historic significance, but another, stating that two fellows called Arthur Roebuck Rudge and William Price Green had invented something called the biophantascope and were early pioneers of cinema, whatever that was. Roaming a little in the still charming but terribly busy city, she discovered something else even more extraordinary. Just behind Russell Street, on Gay Street, which sloped steeply down from King's Circus, Mary discovered the House of Frankenstein. She could not look. I was astonished at how they brought to life the composition of her evidently most famous novel. It seemed her creation had spawned many others in every imaginable media: dolls, cartoons, games, posters for plays and films, and all kinds of ephemera, gewgaws and baubles. Her eyes darted back and forth across the exhibit. "It's alive!" cried the scientist, electrified by the success of his creation. The ghastly creature arose and his grim visage was repeated in countless variants. Yet the horror transmogrified into comedy, and laughter almost drowned out the screams. There's a light over at the Frankenstein's place. Dr. Frankenstein, Frankenstein, became Dr. Frankenfurter, a transvestite for transsexual Transylvania. Yet time and time again, the creator was confused with his creation, until man and monster fused, became one cultural entity. Frankenstein, spawning son of, bride of, and myriad other iterations. I have become the mother of monsters, so it would seem. Contemplating this in the galvanic glow of a recreation of hair doctor's laboratory, the lute crackle of electricity and screams nearly drowning out thought, she reflected on her legacy. Her mind convulsed like a frog's legs attached to an alternating current. How we had pondered back then if the dead could be reanimated. Perhaps it had been wishful thinking, having suffered so much bereavement. Only natural, some might say. But such experiments with the mysteries of life were unnatural, and a sign of man's, yes, always, hubris and vaulting ambition. It was the ultimate romantic fallacy that our creations took on a life of their own, that we, as creators, could steal the fire of the gods. In a flash, she was back at Byron's villa overlooking Lake Geneva as lightning engraved the sky of that wet and genial summer. Vividly, Mary recalled the vision she had been granted after that night ghost stories. Her imagination untrammeled and enervated by the charged air and frisson of ideas and personalities of that potent summer. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling by the thing he had created, and by the work of some powerful engine show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, vital heart motion. Frightful must it be, and supremely frightful for any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. Whirling, she departed via Villa Diodati, now in private ownership, and soared across the Alps of Chamonix, where she and Percy had journeyed after their visit to Byron. She had recorded this journey in her History of a 6 Weeks tour. Yes, Percy had added a little here and there, but the work was primarily hers. She was shocked to see the regression of the glacier there, even considering its annual summer melt. Though she had fond memories of that place, travelling with her soon-to-be husband, it was with growing dread that she swept over the Alps, seeing how little ice remained. It would seem that since that year without summer, there have been many years without winter. What had caused this catastrophic change in climate? Then it had been the eruption of a Japanese volcano, darkening Europe's skies, occluding the sun, and causing crops to fail and prices to rise, and famine and suffering to ensue. What was it now? And yet this was not the most alarming of her discoveries. As Mary flew over the continent like a migratory bird, she could not believe how much development had happened during her spell down below. There were buildings and roads everywhere, the latter calling the vehicles like so many large ants. Factories spewing their toxic byproducts into the skies and rivers. Whole hillsides formed of trash. And there were so few forests. My fellow creatures of the air were fewer too. It saddened her almost as much as the loss of her own children. For were not the birds and other creatures we shared our world with the children of creation? Feeling the black dog descend, Mary sank earthwards. She barely made it back across the channel, so heavy was her heart, but still the sight of the white cliffs stirred something within her bosom. She made her way towards the capital, where she gravitated instinctively towards St. Pancras Old Church Garden, alighting at the original grave of her beloved mother and father, and his second wife, Mary Jane Claremont, mother of her friend, but no mother to her. She was touched to see it still there, although confused that now there seemed to be two graves, the other back at St. Peter's. With great tenderness, she brushed her phantom fingers over the tombstone, lingering on the letters of the epitaph, barely legible now beneath the lichen and blackened tint of London pollution. It was here, when it was purely the grave of my mother, that I used to have trysts with Percy. Some said we had made love here, but I would not deign to respond to such licentious rumour-mongering. What happens between a man and woman in love is sacrosanct. In the face of public opprobrium, they had fled to the continent, even before Percy had divorced his first wife. His delights at the birth of his child by her was nearly eclipsed by the grief of her suicide. His heart was wont to grow, even after we were married. Such was his nature. I could not forgive these excesses of affection, but I could understand them. Percy was too full of life to share with just one person. His roving heart was only finally at rest when buried beside me. Visitors to the grave were navigated by their little handheld devices. Mary watched curiously over their shoulders. It seemed these magic boxes contained a vast amount of information about the world, and so she plunged into one. At first, she was nearly drowned by the binary sea she found herself in, but then she quickly became adept at navigating them. Through what she discovered was called the Internet, Mary explored the history of the world since her demise 173 years ago. Wars beyond imagining, disasters, revolutions, inventions, a flicker book of kings and queens, prime ministers and leaders. Her mind was really overwhelmed by the revelations she discovered. Yet there were two things that stood out more than most. Something called the Me Too movement, in which brave women stood up to the misogynistic pigs. It seemed all too apparent that the travails of the fairer sex had not diminished, despite the remarkable achievements of the suffragettes, whose tireless efforts Mary quickly discovered had earned women the right to vote, and all those who had lobbied and campaigned for better pay, fairer conditions, and an equal place at the table. Now, in an age when women could become anything they wanted, an engineer, athlete, entertainer, academic, astronaut, captain of industry, even president, her sisters were still enduring prejudice, exploitation, and ignorance. If the example of herself and her pioneering mother helped inspire these generations of women to rise above their lot, then Mary felt that her time on earth had not been wasted, regardless of any literary or genetic legacy. My fellow sisters, keep fighting the good fight. You can achieve anything a man can, and more. Yes, the other discovery made her question the very validity of what it is to be human. It was astonishing to discover that not only was her most famous novel considered to have spawned a whole new genre called science fiction, and herself the origin of the species no less, but that such a genre should foresee many of the changes that she now could behold about her in common usage. Not least of these was the form of so-called artificial intelligence, or AI as it was popularly referred to. It seemed humankind had created something smarter and more powerful than itself. Had the creators of the AI not read her book? Perhaps they had, but they had clearly not understood it. These modern Prometheans had created something that could not be uncreated, it seemed. It had developed in sophistication at an alarming rate, and no one quite knew where it would end. I ought to be thy Adam, but am rather the fallen angel. Indeed. Not only will such development threaten the livelihoods of millions in the most ordained professions and most exalted, she discovered it is possible to use something called generative AI to write novels on your behalf. God help humanity, whose minds and limbs may atrophy through disuse. Now it seemed the students of the future need only be imbeciles, unable to hone their critical faculties or skills as she was forced to do to flourish in such intellectual society as she was raised in. The child of such formidable intellects as her parents. She decided to test the efficiency of this authorial automaton. Nervously, she commanded it to write a story in the style of Mary Shelley. It took mere seconds to do something. Mary read it with dread, but soon found herself amused and appalled in equal measure. It was nothing more than a substandard pastiche with insipid imaginative powers and some rather peculiar syntactical glitches. She found originality and genius and nothing to fear from such toys. Reassured that there will always be a place for good writing and great minds, Mary exercised herself with the device she had possessed briefly, bid farewell to her parental tomb, and returned to her own. It was a relief to return to the glorious south coast and the umbrageous dower of her final resting place back at St. Peter's. Her unexpected emancipation had been exhilarating, but exhausting. The modern world was full of wonders and terrors, and so perhaps not too different from the one she had known. Not wishing to be a female Lionel Verney, a last woman doomed to wander the earth when all that she had known and loved had long turned to dust, she descended into the welcoming embrace of the grave to her family and beloved who waited for her there, silently, patiently, behind the veil, ready to give up her ghost gladly. I shall happily rest at peace, knowing at least that my life had not been in vain, and that something of worth remained, and more vincit mortem indeed. Open the doors of life and death, and allow your errant daughter to enter, for now I finally welcome the end.